Batya, what's on your radar?
Well, as you mentioned in your radar, Robbie, much of last week was taken up with a rather tedious argument of definition. After Thursday's GDP report revealed that economic growth fell for the second quarter in a row by 0.9%, many pointed out that this meets the technical definition of a recession, a fall in GDP in 2 consecutive quarters. The White House pushed back, pointing to the strong labor market as evidence that we shouldn't view this as a recession, but rather as, quote, transitioning from a historically strong recovery into a period of more stable and steady growth. Now, critics accuse the White House of gaslighting, something that they do often and with abandon. But in this case, I think the Biden administration has a point, at least according to the 5 economists I spoke to last week. The White House is right that the labor market is strong. There are 11 million unfilled jobs, and the economy has been adding about 400,000 jobs a month. Spend 5 minutes walking around your neighborhood, talking to local business owners, and you'll learn that everyone is struggling to find workers. It seems extremely unlikely that this recession will lead to major layoffs, at least in the near term. The opposite, U.S. labor costs increased in the second quarter, boosting higher wages. Construction saw 4% year-over-year growth. Manufacturing saw 5.1% year-over-year growth and has a 6.7% vacancy rate. Leisure and hospitality saw 7.8% year-over-year growth. If it weren't for inflation, these numbers would represent the first real wage growth labor has seen in 40 years. Instead, inflation is driving down real wages and devastating American families. When inflation is 9.1%, you're bringing home less money even with an 8% raise. There's a kind of awful irony to people finally seeing a wage increase after 40 years, only to have it get eaten up at the gas pump and the grocery store. But calling this a recession isn't going to put money in those families' bank accounts. All it does is flatten this moment of a lot of important context. Rana Foroohar, a business columnist and associate editor at the Financial Times, pointed out that pre-pandemic, the U.S. had been in the longest expansionary period we've had since 1845, which is basically when they started keeping records of this kind of thing. The reason for this long period of growth is that the Federal Reserve had been doing what's called quantitative easing, which basically means that they were putting money into the economy, and they kept interest rates low to artificially stretch out the business cycle by making it easy to borrow and bolstering asset prices. The Fed can't build a new factory, but it can make rates low and make it easy for you to borrow money and cheap, Foroohar explained. But this period of extended growth was due to come to an end. And then the pandemic hit, which added a huge wild card to the expected slowdown because globally different countries were out of sync in terms of when they were closing down and when they were opening up. And then you had a third wild card, the war in Ukraine, which fueled an energy and food shock. So all of these wild cards together make this a pretty unique moment in history. And then there's the fact that the S&P 500 reported its biggest monthly gains since 2020 last week. Stocks rallied when investors began to believe that the Federal Reserve might not be as aggressive in raising interest rates as they had feared. And exports, too, have expanded, rising at a whopping 18% annual rate. So if the labor market and Wall Street are not in crisis, where exactly is the recession? Where has GDP contracted? Remember those struggling American families? It's there. The constricting areas of the economy are in inventory, energy, and housing. Families are pulling back on buying electronics, furniture, food, and gas. Kraft Heinz is bracing for consumers to cut back. Arm & Hammer is seeing more demand for low-cost laundry detergent and cat litter. Store brand goods are gaining market share over brand name items because every little bit helps. McDonald's and Chipotle said that low-income customers are coming in less and buying cheaper menu items. As the Wall Street Journal put it, quote, many consumers who weathered the pandemic with the help of government stimulus and fewer expenses of their own are running out of steam. Some of them now face the return of commuting costs, a need for new work clothes, and steeper childcare expenses. With Americans buying fewer goods, companies have had to cut prices to reduce merchandise. The result is that inventory of food and cars are responsible for the bulk of the slowdown. In addition to gas and private inventories, a housing downturn is gathering steam. We all remember how housing prices surged throughout the pandemic. Between April 2020 and April 2021, the price of the average home increased by 16%, the largest single-year increase since 1992. As people fled cities during lockdown, you started to see these stories about couples desperately bidding $50,000 over asking price to buy a home sight unseen and then losing out to another couple. Those days are over. Home sales have fallen by 20% this year, with a third of the inventory cutting prices due to less demand. Housing is now the least affordable it's been since the 1980s. The average home price is more than 6 times the median household income, and interest rates for mortgages are now at an obscene 6%. It's led developers to pull the brakes on building new housing, with residential investment falling by 12%. This will only increase the radical mismatch between supply and demand at a time when the U.S. is already facing a huge housing shortage. Last year, Freddie Mac estimated the shortage at 3.8 million housing units. This isn't a recession so much as a total assault on the middle class. From car ownership and energy to home ownership to eating out, the hallmarks of a middle class life are being pulled further and further out of reach for millions and millions of Americans. Here's the thing. Inflation is going to come down at some point. Gas prices are going to improve. They already are, however slowly, however little. The one piece of this puzzle that's not going anywhere is the price of a home relative to wages. While blue metro areas tend to have a higher wage floor, that's also where the housing crisis is concentrated. Meanwhile, the mass migration from blue states to red states definitely drove up the housing market in places like Florida and Texas, though not by enough to offset the housing divide. One study found that the average home sale price in 2019 in Democratic-leaning counties was $428,000, compared to nearly half that in Republican counties, where it was $245,000. Zoning laws protecting both the environment and Tony elite neighborhoods have resulted in much less inventory in housing in Democrat-led counties, and as a result, it's led to soaring prices. Middle and working class New Yorkers and Californians find themselves competing with lawyers and software developers for a limited number of homes and apartments that actually no one feels they can afford. And when the left does talk about housing, these conversations are almost always focused on the dependent poor, finding ways to force middle-class neighborhoods to accept a high rise for homeless people or giving out more Section 8 housing vouchers. That's when they aren't suggesting that Americans give up on wanting their own homes altogether and urging the government instead to incentivize renting for life, as a recent New York Times podcast did. Why this antipathy for the American dream for their neighbors? Tom Wolfe explored this in his book Radical Chic, where he argued that elites reproduce their status by doing the painstaking work of distinguishing themselves from the middle class. Every middle and working class person knows that crime, poverty, and drugs are connected, and that building a high rise for homeless people will build all of those things into their neighborhood where they're clutching at the American dream. So members in elite standing have to oppose that to establish their elite standing, which is defined by its distance from the bourgeois values of the middle class. It's NIMBYism to oppose importing thousands of mentally ill drug addicts into your neighborhood. We're the YIMBY movement. I'm not suggesting that these people don't truly have compassion for the poor in their hearts. They obviously do, but their compassion is apparently totally compatible with pulling up the ladder to a middle-class life from their working-class neighbors, the people delivering their Amazon packages and driving them home from the bar in an Uber and stocking the shelves at their local grocery. Which brings me back to the question of a recession. If the left is kicking out the ladder to home ownership, the right's obsession with calling what we're in a recession seems to me a similar kind of conceptual erasure of the middle and working class, because many of the problems we're seeing are a long time in the making. What we're seeing is less a recession and more just a radical acceleration of the pressures squeezing the middle class that have long been at play. The housing market puts home ownership out of reach for much of the working class, eviscerating upward social mobility. Wages have stagnated over the course of 4 decades, even as production has skyrocketed. Eating out now is no longer affordable for the middle class, while gas prices are now limiting the mobility of middle-class families in a very literal way. Much of this is not new, and finding a convenient way to pin it all on President Biden, it might feel good, but it's dishonest, aside from the price of gas, which, of course, Biden's green agenda certainly helped drive up. The rest of this, much of what we're seeing in terms of the reversal of upward mobility for the lower classes has been decades in the making. And it seems to me that both sides are really struggling to acknowledge their role in that awful trend and to discuss how we collectively fix it. What say you, Robbie?
Well, I think I mostly agree, and I agree with your point that we can't all pin this on President Biden or anything like that. And the increasing not affordable nature of life for the middle class is it's a huge problem. Now, it's not a problem that is evenly spread out, right? You still can. It's harder than it used to be, but you can purchase a home. You can find somewhere to live more affordably. If you look outside blue enclaves, right? If you look in Middle America, you can find affordable places. Now, this is cold comfort, I think, to a lot of otherwise progressive young people, right, who love the bustle and thrills of your New Yorks and Chicagos and maybe Washington D.C.s or L.A., et cetera. And those places, they've become totally unaffordable. And look, I agree with you, obviously, that we certainly need more housing. More supply of housing could not hurt. And in too many of those places, there are checks. There's too much veto power over new development, right? The environmental veto power, the characteristic of the neighborhood. Sort of, oh no, what if you bulldoze this, ugly mall that's been there all of 20 years? We can't do that. So that's kind of it's a blue, but just kind of neighborly conservative stuff. Although I don't know, you were kind of making fun of the YIMBY people, right?
Yeah, because the YIMBY people are always trying to get the dependent poor into middle-class neighborhoods, when what they should be doing is the opposite, creating, a much more robust and expansive, a set of middle-class neighborhoods, making it possible for middle-class people to live in their neighborhoods rather than penalizing middle-class people who don't want to be importing crime into their neighborhoods, where they have children. Yeah, well, I mean, I agree. Section 8 housing is huge. I've seen living in D.C., I've seen the problems with it. I've been in buildings that, because of the exact kind of thing you're describing, became unlivable for ordinary people because they were all of a sudden unsafe because you exported, right, the people who are on the streets into the building. And that's the kind of homeless and drug addiction and mental illness problem, I guess we do talk about on the show a lot, is something, right? I don't think that housing is necessarily itself the answer to. I mean, we're talking about drug addiction. We're talking about not being able to provide people who need psychiatric care and drug cessation care, that kind of stuff before we even talk about the housing. But I don't know. I want to build more. Obviously, build more everywhere, and we've made it too prohibitively difficult to do anything of the sort in this country, and that would certainly help. Amen. All right, we'll have more Rising right after this.